7 terrifying true stories from abandoned mental hospitals. Story number 1, by Alex Manning. In 2015, I was in college in Massachusetts, and my friends and I had heard countless rumors about Danvers State Hospital. Its eerie Gothic architecture and dark history of inhumane treatments, like lobotomies and electroshock therapy, made it the perfect place for a late-night thrill. We'd seen YouTube videos of urban explorers going inside, and we decided to see for ourselves if the stories about ghostly encounters were true. It was a cold October night when we arrived. The hospital's hulking silhouette loomed against the sky, its broken windows and overgrown grounds looking like something out of a horror movie. Armed with flashlights, we climbed through a gap in the fence and made our way inside. The first thing that struck me was the silence. It wasn't the kind of quiet you'd expect from an abandoned building. It was oppressive, almost alive. Every step we took echoed unnaturally down the long, crumbling hallways. The peeling paint on the walls and the rusted gurneys scattered about added to the unsettling atmosphere. We started in what looked like an old patient ward. Beds with torn mattresses were pushed against the walls, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. I noticed a small, broken doll lying on one of the beds, its head cracked and one eye missing. "Creepy," Jenna, one of my friends, muttered, poking at it with her flashlight. As we moved deeper into the hospital, we found a room filled with dusty file cabinets. Inside were patient records, some dating back to the 1940s. I pulled one out and read it aloud. Subject: Mary H. Diagnosis, hysteria, treatment, electroshock therapy. The words sent a chill down my spine. It was hard to imagine the suffering that had taken place here. That's when we heard it, a loud, piercing scream echoing through the halls. My heart stopped as we all froze in place. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Everyone nodded, their faces pale. We decided to follow the sound, our flashlights shaking as we walked. The farther we went, the colder it became, as if the temperature was dropping with every step. Then we saw it, a shadow darting across the hallway ahead of us. It was human-shaped, but moved unnaturally fast. "Hello?" Jenna called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, just the sound of our own breathing and the faint creak of the building settling. We turned a corner and found ourselves in what appeared to be the hospital's old operating room. Rusted surgical tools were scattered across a table, and a single metal chair sat in the center, its straps frayed but still intact. As we approached, the chair began to rock slowly on its own. "Okay, this is too much," Tom, another friend, said. "We need to get out of here." We turned to leave, but the door we had just come through was now jammed shut. Panic set in as we tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the rocking chair stopped, and the room fell into an eerie silence. That's when we heard faint whispers, indistinct but unmistakable. They seemed to come from all around us, growing louder and more urgent. In a frenzy, we finally managed to shove the door open and bolted down the hallway. But the layout of the hospital felt different. Hallways we had just walked through were now blocked by debris, and staircases seemed to lead nowhere. It was as if the building itself was trying to trap us. After what felt like an eternity, we found our way back to the hole in the fence and ran to our car. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away. To this day, I can't explain what we saw or heard that night. Some say the spirits of Danvers patients still linger, trapped by the trauma they endured. All I know is that I'll never set foot in that hospital again. What happened there, both in its operational years and after, feels like a scar on the world, one that refuses to heal. Story number 2, by Maria Torres. In 2018, I was part of a historical preservation group working to document the history of forgotten places. Our latest project took us to Forest Haven Asylum in Laurel, Maryland, a facility that had gained infamy for its dark past. Forest Haven, built in 1925, was supposed to be a safe haven for individuals with intellectual disabilities. Instead, it became a symbol of neglect, abuse, and death. The asylum had been closed since 1991, but the buildings still stood, their decaying walls hiding countless stories. My colleague Ben and I arrived early in the morning, armed with cameras, notebooks, and a map of the grounds. As we stepped through the rusted gates, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the distant rustle of wind through the trees. The asylum was massive, with several buildings connected by overgrown paths. Inside, the hallways were filled with broken furniture, peeling paint, and graffiti. We passed what looked like a recreation room, where an old piano stood covered in dust, its keys warped and cracked. I pressed one key out of curiosity, and the hollow note echoed eerily through the space. As we moved deeper into the complex, we stumbled upon a small cemetery. It was unmarked, just a patch of overgrown grass and a few scattered stones. I felt a wave of unease as we approached. "This must be where they buried the residents," Ben said, his voice low. We started looking around, and that's when we saw it. A single weathered headstone, barely legible under the moss and dirt. I knelt to read the inscription, "In memory of those who died forgotten." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't help but think of the hundreds of patients who had died here, many from neglect or improper care. These were lives reduced to a single shared grave marker. I was taking a photograph of the headstone when I heard a faint, choking sound behind me. At first, I thought it was Ben clearing his throat, but when I turned around, I saw him clutching his neck, his face pale, and his eyes wide with terror. "I can't breathe," he gasped, stumbling backward. Panic surged through me. I grabbed his arm and tried to pull him away from the gravesite, but he collapsed to his knees, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. "Ben, we need to go," I shouted, my voice trembling. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he managed to stand, and we hurried back toward the main path. As soon as we were a few yards away from the cemetery, Ben's breathing returned to normal. He leaned against a tree, shaking. "Something didn't want us there," he whispered, his voice barely audible. We decided to cut our exploration short and head back to the car. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just the oppressive atmosphere of the place, or maybe Ben had a panic attack triggered by the cemetery's grim history. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I later learned that Forest Haven had a mass grave where hundreds of residents were buried after dying from neglect and mistreatment. Many of their families were never notified, and their identities remain unknown. The cemetery we stumbled upon was likely part of this dark history. To this day, I can't explain the choking sensation Ben experienced or the overwhelming sense of dread I felt at the cemetery. Forest Haven is more than just an abandoned asylum. It's a monument to suffering and forgotten lives. And whatever lingers there, it hasn't forgotten its tragic past. Story number 3, by Mark Benson. In 2016, I was deep into urban exploration, fascinated by forgotten places with dark histories. Bybury State Hospital in Philadelphia was at the top of my list. Known for its inhumane treatment of patients, overcrowding, and neglect, the asylum had been closed since 1990. Its abandoned halls were a magnet for explorers, but the stories of eerie encounters and unexplained phenomena made it even more intriguing. One chilly autumn evening, I decided to visit Bybury with two of my friends, Tom and Sarah. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the hospital's crumbling silhouette framed by the fading light. The building was massive, its walls covered in graffiti and its windows shattered. A rusted "no trespassing" sign hung crookedly near the entrance, but we ignored it, slipping inside through a broken window. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and decay. The halls were eerily quiet, the only sound coming from our footsteps, echoing off the walls. We started in what appeared to be an old administrative wing, where rusted desks and overturned filing cabinets lined the rooms. Patient records were scattered across the floor, their yellowed pages detailing treatments and diagnoses that sounded barbaric by today's standards. One file caught my attention. It was a photograph of a young man, his face gaunt and hollow. The notes described him as prone to violent outbursts and listed treatments that included isolation and electroshock therapy. I felt a chill as I imagined the horrors this person must have endured within these walls. We moved deeper into the building, reaching what looked like a patient ward. The beds were still there, their frames rusted and mattresses torn. Sarah picked up a tattered hospital gown lying on the floor, and as she held it up, I noticed a dark stain on the fabric. "Let's keep moving," Tom said, his voice uneasy. That's when we heard it, a loud crash from the floor above us. We froze, our flashlights flickering as we instinctively huddled together. "It's probably just an animal," Tom whispered, though his face betrayed his doubt. Against our better judgment, we decided to investigate. We climbed the stairs cautiously, each step creaking under our weight. As we reached the second floor, the air grew noticeably colder. I could see my breath fogging in the beam of my flashlight. At the end of the hallway stood a wheelchair, its metal frame gleaming faintly in the dim light. We were certain it hadn't been there before. The wheelchair was positioned perfectly in the center of the hall, facing us. "That's weird," Sarah muttered, taking a step back. Suddenly, the wheelchair began to move. It rolled slowly at first, then gained speed, heading straight toward us. We screamed and ran back down the stairs, but the building seemed different now. Hallways we had just walked through appeared unfamiliar, as if the layout of the hospital had changed. Panic set in as we tried to find the exit. "This way!" Tom shouted, leading us down a narrow corridor. As we turned a corner, we found ourselves in a large room filled with graffiti and scattered debris. The walls were covered in phrases like, "They never left," and "Help me." In the center of the room stood a rusted gurney, its wheels squeaking as it rocked back and forth. The movement was slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was pushing it. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. We retraced our steps as best we could, finally finding the window we had entered through. The moment we stepped outside, the oppressive feeling lifted, replaced by the crisp night air. We ran back to our car without looking back. As we drove away, Sarah noticed something odd in the rearview mirror. "Stop the car," she said, her voice trembling. We pulled over, and she pointed toward the hospital. In one of the broken windows, a faint light flickered, as if someone was standing there, watching us. To this day, I can't explain what happened inside Byberry State Hospital. The wheelchair, the gurney, the shifting hallways, it all felt too real to be a coincidence. Some say the spirits of the patients still linger, trapped by the trauma they endured. All I know is that Byberry left a mark on me, and I'll never go back. Story number 4. By Sophie Caldwell. In 2021, my brother Ethan and I visited the abandoned Peat Island Mental Hospital, located just north of Sydney, Australia. The hospital had been closed for over a decade, but its grim history of abuse, neglect, and unexplained deaths had always fascinated me. Ethan was reluctant, but I convinced him to come along, promising it would be just a quick look around. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the crumbling buildings. The isolation of the island was palpable, with the only sounds being the rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional distant bird call. It was easy to imagine how lonely and forgotten the patients must have felt in this place. The main building was eerily intact, despite the years of abandonment. The paint was peeling, and the windows were shattered, but remnants of its former life were still there. Rusted bed frames, broken wheelchairs, and faded patient charts scattered across the floor. The air was thick, carrying a faint, musty odor that seemed to seep from the walls. We eventually found ourselves standing in front of Ward 4, the part of the hospital that had been notorious for its harsh treatment of patients. Rumors claimed this ward was more like a prison, where the most difficult residents were confined. I felt a chill as I pushed open the heavy door, which creaked loudly in protest. The room was dim, even with our flashlights. The walls were covered in scratch marks, and rusted restraints hung from the bedposts. It was impossible not to feel the weight of what had happened here. "This place is giving me the creeps," Ethan muttered, his voice breaking the silence. I nodded, but my curiosity pushed me to keep going. As we walked through the ward, I felt a sudden chill brush past my arm. It wasn't just cold, it felt like a hand, icy and deliberate. "Did you feel that?" I asked Ethan, but he shook his head, looking at me like I was crazy. I shrugged it off, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Then we heard it, a faint crying sound, coming from the far corner of the room. Ethan froze, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "You heard that, right?" he whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. We shone our flashlights toward the corner, but there was nothing there. The crying grew louder, echoing off the walls, and my legs felt like they were made of lead. "Hello?" Ethan called out hesitantly, his voice trembling. There was no response, just the relentless sound of sobbing. We decided it was time to leave, but as we turned toward the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Ethan and I ran to the door, pulling at it with all our strength, but it wouldn't budge. My breathing grew shallow as I felt a suffocating pressure in the room, like the air was being sucked out. Just when I thought we were trapped for good, the door creaked open on its own. We didn't waste a second. We bolted out of the ward and back into the open air, not stopping until we reached the boat that had brought us to the island. As we caught our breath, I looked back at the hospital. For a split second, I saw a figure standing in one of the broken windows, a shadowy silhouette watching us. When I pointed it out to Ethan, it was gone. After that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had encountered something beyond our understanding. I later learned that multiple patients had died in Ward 4 under mysterious circumstances, their deaths often blamed on misbehavior or unexplained health issues. I'll never forget the icy touch, the crying, or the figure in the window. Pete Island Mental Hospital is more than just a relic of the past. It's a place where the pain and suffering of its former residents still linger. I haven't been back, and I never will. Some places are better left undisturbed. Story number 5. By Maria Lopez. In 2018, I moved to San Francisco for a new job and found what I thought was the perfect apartment. It was a small, cozy unit in an old Victorian building, the kind of place that oozed charm and character. The landlord mentioned that the building had a long history, dating back to the early 1900s, but he left out any mention of what I was about to experience. The first few weeks went smoothly. I loved my new neighborhood, the tall windows that let in plenty of sunlight, and the creaky wooden floors that gave the place a sense of nostalgia. But one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange. My bedroom window overlooked a narrow alley, and I could swear I saw a figure standing just outside, staring in. It was a woman in a long, dark dress, her face pale and expressionless. At first, I thought it must be a neighbor or someone passing through the alley, but when I looked again, she was gone. Shrugging it off as my imagination, I went to bed. The next night, it happened again. This time, I saw her more clearly. She was standing closer to the window, her hands pressed against the glass as if she was trying to peer inside. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Gathering my courage, I walked to the window, but before I could reach it, she vanished. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a shadow, a trick of the light. But as the weeks went on, the figure became a regular occurrence. Sometimes, I'd see her standing still, her lifeless eyes fixed on me. Other times, I'd hear faint tapping on the glass, only to find the alley empty when I checked. One particularly chilling night, I was lying in bed when I heard a soft voice whisper my name. It was faint, but unmistakable, like someone standing right next to me. I bolted upright, turning on every light in the apartment. The whispers stopped, but the oppressive feeling of being watched lingered. I finally decided to confide in my upstairs neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Carter, who had lived in the building for decades. When I mentioned the figure in the window, her face turned pale. "You've seen her too, haven't you?" she asked quietly. My stomach dropped as she told me about a woman named Eleanor who had lived in my apartment in the 1920s. According to Mrs. Carter, Eleanor had fallen in love with a man who lived across the alley. When he broke off their relationship, she became distraught and jumped to her death from my bedroom window. "She's been here ever since," Mrs. Carter said, "always watching, always waiting." After that conversation, the sightings became more intense. I started seeing Eleanor during the day, her reflection flickering in mirrors or windows. Once, I even woke up to find the window open, though I always kept it locked. I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. The final straw came when I woke up one night to find the figure standing inside the room, just a few feet from my bed. Her face was pale, her expression blank, but her presence was suffocating. I screamed, and she vanished before my eyes. I moved out the next week, breaking my lease and leaving half my belongings behind. The landlord didn't seem surprised when I told him why. "You're not the first," he said simply. To this day, I still see her in my nightmares. Eleanor, staring through the window, waiting for someone to notice her pain. The apartment was charming, yes, but it came with a ghost who refused to leave. I'll never live in an old building again, and I'll never forget the haunting presence of the woman at the window. Story number 6, by Mark Thompson. In 2017, I was working on a photography project about historical landmarks in Boston. As part of the project, I decided to visit an old cemetery that dated back to the 1700s. The place was known for its eerie beauty, crumbling headstones, overgrown pathways, and an air of quiet solemnity. I arrived just before sunset, hoping to capture the golden hour light filtering through the trees. The cemetery was larger than I expected, with rows of leaning gravestones and crypts scattered throughout. As I set up my camera near an especially weathered headstone, I noticed how still everything was. There was no wind, no bird calls, just an oppressive silence that seemed unnatural. Brushing it off, I began taking photos, focusing on the intricate carvings on the stones. About 20 minutes in, I heard it, a faint whisper, almost like a sigh. I froze, thinking someone might be nearby, but when I looked around, the cemetery was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. No response. I went back to photographing, convincing myself it was the wind, but the whispers started again, growing louder. This time, I could make out faint words. "Go. Leave. Not safe." My skin prickled as I turned to look behind me, but there was no one there. The words felt like they were coming from the air itself, surrounding me in a way I couldn't explain. As the sun dipped lower, I decided to move to another part of the cemetery. I wandered toward a crypt that looked like it hadn't been opened in centuries. The door was sealed shut, but the carvings above it bore the name Nathaniel Blake, 1747-1816. I adjusted my camera to take a shot when I heard a distinct creaking noise, like a door slowly opening. My heart stopped as I turned to see the heavy stone door of the crypt shift slightly, leaving a narrow gap. A cold breeze emanated from the opening, even though the air had been perfectly still moments before. My camera slipped from my hands as I stumbled back, the whispers now a cacophony of voices. "Go away. Leave us. You don't belong here." Panic set in as I scrambled to grab my camera and back away from the crypt. The whispers turned into low murmurs, then an audible voice that seemed to echo all around me. "You've disturbed us." I couldn't tell if it was one voice or many, but it was filled with a cold, inhuman rage. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain on my shoulder, as if someone had grabbed me. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. The air behind me felt heavy, pressing against my back like an invisible force. I broke into a run, stumbling over uneven ground and fallen branches as I tried to find the exit. As I reached the gates, I heard one final whisper, clear and unmistakable. "Don't come back." I didn't stop running until I was safely inside my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. When I got home, I reviewed the photos on my camera. Most of them were normal, but one image made my blood run cold. It was a shot of the crypt, taken just before I heard the door creak open. Standing in front of the crypt was a faint, shadowy figure, a tall man with indistinct features, his head tilted as if he were staring directly at me. I deleted the photo immediately, too terrified to keep it. The experience left me shaken, and I never went back to that cemetery. I later learned that Nathaniel Blake, whose name was carved on the crypt, was rumored to have been a cruel man in life. Locals believed his spirit lingered in the cemetery, angry and vengeful toward anyone who disturbed his rest. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard that evening, but I know one thing for sure. Some places are better left undisturbed. The whispers, the crypt, and the shadowy figure still haunt my memories, and I'll never set foot in another cemetery alone again. Story number 7. By Lindsay Parker. In 2015, my grandmother gave me a porcelain doll that had been in our family for generations. She handed it to me during a visit, her face filled with nostalgia as she placed it in my hands. "This doll belonged to your great-grandmother," she said. "It's been passed down to every eldest daughter. Now it's your turn." The doll was beautiful, but eerie, with pale porcelain skin, dark curls, and glassy blue eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you moved. It wore an old-fashioned lace-trimmed dress, slightly yellowed with age. I thanked my grandmother, though I wasn't particularly fond of dolls, and brought it home, placing it on a shelf in my bedroom. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but after a few days, I started to notice small, unsettling things. The doll would be in a different position than where I had left it. Sometimes its head would tilt slightly to the side, as if it were watching me. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I'd bumped the shelf or misremembered how I had positioned it. One night, I woke up to the sound of something falling. I turned on the light to find the doll lying on the floor, even though I was sure I'd placed it securely on the shelf before going to bed. Its glassy eyes stared up at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I picked it up and put it back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the next few weeks, the occurrences became more frequent and more disturbing. I would wake up in the middle of the night to faint whispers, too soft to make out the words, but loud enough to jolt me awake. Once, I swore I heard it say my name. I began avoiding my bedroom as much as possible, leaving the doll untouched on the shelf. The breaking point came one night when I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the doll's head slowly turn toward me. I froze, my heart racing as I stared at it, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But then, clear as day, I heard a faint giggle coming from the doll's direction. I screamed and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't go back until the next morning, when I cautiously opened the door to find the doll sitting on the edge of my bed, its legs dangling over the side. There was no way I could have placed it there. It had moved on its own. Terrified, I decided to confront my grandmother about the doll. When I told her what had been happening, her expression turned serious. "You're not the first," she said quietly. She explained that the doll had been passed down through the family for generations, and every owner had experienced strange occurrences. "Your great-grandmother always said it was playful, but I think there's something more to it," she admitted. Desperate to rid myself of the doll, I asked if I could return it to her. She agreed, taking it back without question. "Be careful with her," she said, as I handed it over. "She doesn't like to be ignored." After that, the strange events stopped. My room felt lighter, and I was finally able to sleep peacefully again. But I couldn't forget the doll's glassy stare, or the sound of that faint giggle. My grandmother still keeps the doll on a shelf in her living room, and every time I visit, I catch myself glancing at it, half expecting it to move. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Was it a family curse? A spirit attached to the doll? I don't know, and I don't want to find out. I only know one thing for sure. I'll never bring that doll into my home again. Some heirlooms are better left in the past, no matter how much history they carry. And that wraps up 7 scary things that happened in abandoned mental hospitals. These chilling tales remind us that some places hold on to their history in ways we can't explain. Whether it's ghostly apparitions, eerie whispers, or unexplainable phenomena, these encounters show that the past is never truly gone. Which story gave you the biggest chills? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. Until next time, stay curious, but tread carefully.